The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Thompson's perfectly maintained front lawn. At 93 years old, he moved slower than he used to, but his daily routine never changed. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., he would carefully make his way down the front porch steps, leaning slightly on his wooden cane, to collect his morning newspaper. The neighbors often saw Harold, dressed in his neat khaki pants and pressed button-down shirt, spending hours in his garden. His wrinkled hands, which had once held rifles in World War II, now tenderly cared for his beloved roses. The beautiful red and yellow flowers lined his white picket fence, making his house the prettiest one on Cedar Street. Harold lived alone in the small blue house he had bought with his late wife Martha 50 years ago. The house wasn't fancy, but it was home. Pictures of his military days hung on the walls, along with photos of Martha and their life together. She had passed away 5 years ago, and since then, Harold had found peace in his quiet routine. Every room in his house told a story. In the living room, his old armchair sat next to a small table holding his reading glasses and favorite books about history. The kitchen remained spotless, with just one coffee cup and plate in the dish rack. Harold was a man who liked everything in its place, a habit he had learned during his military service. His neighbors respected the old veteran. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door often brought him homemade cookies, and the Johnson kids would help him carry his groceries from his car to his house. Harold always thanked them with stories from his younger days, carefully choosing the happy ones that wouldn't scare the children. On this particular morning, Harold followed his usual schedule. After getting his newspaper, he made his coffee and toast, sitting at his small kitchen table. The morning light streamed through the window, highlighting the medals displayed in a glass case on the wall. Each medal reminded him of different moments from his service, both proud and painful memories that he carried with him. As he read the newspaper, Harold could hear the familiar sounds of his neighborhood waking up. Cars starting as people left for work, children laughing as they waited for the school bus, and birds singing in the old oak tree in his backyard. These simple sounds had become the music of his peaceful life. Later that morning, Harold put on his gardening hat and gloves. His doctor had told him he should take it easy at his age, but Harold believed staying active kept him young. He carefully trimmed his roses, pulled out tiny weeds, and watered each plant with care. His garden was more than just flowers. It was his way of adding beauty to the world. In the afternoon, Harold sat on his porch swing, the same one where he and Martha used to watch sunsets together. He waved at passing neighbors and smiled as children rode their bikes past his house. The American flag hanging by his door fluttered gently in the breeze, reminding everyone of his service to his country. Inside his house, Harold kept a small box of letters Martha had written to him during the war. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons like this, he would read them again, hearing her voice in his mind. The letters were old and yellow now, but the love in the words remained as strong as ever. As evening approached, Harold made his simple dinner and watched the news on his old television. He wasn't interested in fancy technology. His flip phone and basic TV were all he needed. His life was simple but meaningful, filled with small pleasures like tending his garden, reading good books, and remembering the happy times with Martha. Before going to bed, Harold looked out his bedroom window at the quiet street below. His neighborhood had always been peaceful, and he was grateful for that. Little did he know that this peace was about to be disturbed in ways he couldn't imagine. But for now, in this moment, Harold Thompson, proud veteran and guardian of his little piece of America, was content in his quiet life. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Harold was trimming his roses when he heard the loud rumble of motorcycle engines. At first, he thought they would pass by, just like any other vehicles on his street, but the noise grew louder and stayed. Looking up from his garden, Harold saw 5 motorcycles pull into the empty lot next to his house. The lot had been vacant since the old Wilson family moved away last year. The bikers were young men dressed in black leather jackets with patches he couldn't quite read. They were laughing loudly and playing music from a portable speaker. Harold tried to focus on his gardening, but the noise made it difficult. The peaceful afternoon he usually enjoyed was now filled with the sound of revving engines and loud rock music. His hands, which normally moved steadily while working with his plants, began to shake slightly from the unexpected stress. That evening, more motorcycles arrived. The empty lot quickly became filled with at least 15 bikes and their riders. They brought coolers full of drinks and set up portable chairs. The music got louder, and their voices grew rougher as the night went on. Harold couldn't even hear his television over the noise. Mrs. Rodriguez came over the next morning, worried about her elderly neighbor. "Did you sleep at all last night, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, bringing him his usual Wednesday cookies. Harold just shook his head, dark circles under his eyes showing his sleepless night. "Maybe they won't come back," Mrs. Rodriguez said hopefully, but she was wrong. The bikers returned every afternoon that week. Each day, they stayed longer and got louder. Empty cans and food wrappers started appearing in Harold's yard, blown over from their gatherings. One morning, Harold found tire marks across the edge of his lawn where someone had obviously driven a motorcycle through his grass. His beautiful roses, which he and Martha had planted together years ago, were partially crushed. The sight made his heart ache. The Johnson kids stopped playing near his house because their parents were worried about the rough-looking bikers. Even the mail carrier started delivering Harold's mail earlier in the day to avoid the afternoon crowds. The peaceful neighborhood Harold had known for 50 years was changing quickly. Harold tried to keep to his routine, but it became harder each day. He couldn't enjoy his morning coffee on the porch because the lot was littered with trash from the night before. His afternoon gardening was interrupted by the constant noise. Even his evening television shows were drowned out by the sound of engines and music. Some of the bikers started noticing the old man next door. They would rev their engines extra loud when passing his house, laughing when he jumped at the sudden noise. A few would stare at him while he worked in his garden, making him feel uncomfortable in his own yard. The American flag by his door still flew proudly, but Harold felt less and less proud of his situation. He, who had faced enemy fire in World War II, now felt nervous walking to his own mailbox. The metals in his kitchen seemed to watch him with disappointment as he closed his curtains early each evening to hide from the chaos outside. One week after the bikers first arrived, Harold sat in his kitchen, holding his old coffee cup with shaking hands. The sound of motorcycles filled the air again. He watched through his window as more bikes pulled into the lot. The riders were setting up what looked like a permanent gathering spot, bringing in old furniture and even a fire pit. That night, Harold couldn't sleep again. He lay in his bed, listening to the loud voices and music from next door. The pictures on his walls trembled slightly with each revving engine. In one photo, young Harold stood proudly in his military uniform, brave and unafraid. Now, at 93, he felt helpless in his own home. As Harold finally drifted off to sleep in the early morning hours, he didn't know that things were about to get worse. The unwelcome changes in his peaceful life were only the beginning of a story that would test his courage once again. After 2 weeks of constant disruption, Harold Thompson decided he needed to speak up. He spent an entire morning practicing what he would say, rehearsing his words in front of his bathroom mirror. The old veteran had faced worse situations in the war, he told himself, though his reflection showed worry in his tired eyes. That afternoon, Harold put on his best navy blue sweater and his veteran's cap. He wanted them to see he deserved respect. Walking with his cane, he made his way to the empty lot where 5 bikers were already gathering. His heart was beating fast, but he kept his head high. "Excuse me," Harold said, his voice firm despite his nervousness. "I'm your neighbor, and I was hoping we could talk about the noise level." He tried to smile, remembering how he used to handle difficult situations when he was a sergeant. The bikers turned to look at him. The biggest one, wearing a leather vest covered in patches, stepped forward. "Well, look who it is," he said with a smirk. "Grandpa's come to visit." The others laughed, making Harold's face turn red. "I'm a veteran," Harold explained, pointing to his cap. "I just ask that you show some respect for the neighborhood. Maybe keep the music down after dark." His voice wasn't as strong now, and his hand gripped his cane tighter. The leader of the group walked closer to Harold. "A veteran, huh?" He sneered. "What do you want? A medal? This ain't your war, old man. We'll do whatever we want here." More laughter followed, crueler this time. Harold stood his ground, though his legs felt weak. "Young man, I've served this country so people like you could be free. All I'm asking is for some basic courtesy." "Listen up, Gramps," another biker called out. "The more you complain, the louder we'll get. Why don't you go back to your little garden and mind your own business?" They revved their engines all at once, making Harold step backward. Walking back to his house, Harold could hear them mocking him. "Look at the tough soldier running away," one shouted. "Maybe he needs his mommy." Another added. Harold's eyes filled with tears, but he wouldn't let them see him cry. The next morning, Harold found his mailbox knocked over. His morning newspaper was torn to pieces across his front lawn. In his garden, someone had walked through his rose bushes, crushing several plants. Martha's favorite yellow roses, which he had tended for years, lay broken on the ground. When Mrs. Rodriguez came to check on him, she found Harold on his knees in the garden, trying to save the damaged flowers. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "you should call the police." But Harold remembered the biker's threats about getting louder if he complained. He shook his head. "That'll only make things worse," he said quietly, his hand sturdy from trying to replant the roses. That evening, the bikers were louder than ever. They drove their motorcycles in circles around the lot, headlights flashing into Harold's windows. Their music was so loud that his whole house seemed to shake. Someone threw empty cans into his yard, laughing when they hit his porch. Harold sat in his dark living room, too afraid to turn on the lights. On his wall, the medals from his service seemed to mock him now. What kind of soldier was he, hiding in his own home? But these weren't enemy soldiers he could fight. These were young men who saw his age as a weakness and his service as a joke. The final straw came 3 days later. Harold woke up to find graffiti on his fence. Someone had written, "Old Man's Territory," in big red letters. Below it, they had drawn a crude picture of a crying old man with a cane. That morning, as Harold stood looking at his ruined fence, something inside him changed. The helplessness in his heart turned to anger. He was a United States veteran, and he had faced worse enemies than playground bullies. His hands were shaking, but not from fear this time. Walking back into his house, Harold looked at the small box of old military items on his desk. Inside, buried under old papers and photographs, was a business card he had kept for years but never used. Maybe it was time to make a call. Harold sat at his kitchen table early that morning, staring at the mess in his front yard. The bikers had outdone themselves last night, leaving broken bottles, cigarette butts, and fast food wrappers scattered across his once pristine lawn. His hands trembled as he tried to lift his coffee cup to his lips. The sound of a motorcycle engine made him spill some coffee. Even in the early morning hours, they were starting to arrive. Harold watched through his window as 2 bikers pulled up, laughing and pointing at the graffiti on his fence. They took pictures with their phones, proud of their handiwork. Mrs. Rodriguez had stopped bringing cookies. The Johnson kids no longer waved as they passed by. Even the mail carrier now quickly dropped off his mail and hurried away. Harold felt completely alone, trapped in his own home by a group of young men who had turned his peaceful life into a nightmare. Standing up slowly, Harold walked to his bedroom. He opened his closet and reached for an old wooden box on the top shelf. Inside were memories from his military days, photographs, medals, and papers he hadn't looked at in years. As he lifted them out one by one, his fingers touched something at the bottom of the box. It was a small, worn business card. The edges were yellow with age, but the text was still clear. "Veterans Association. We support our own." Harold remembered the day he got this card. It was at a memorial service 5 years ago, right after Martha passed away. A young veteran had given it to him, saying, "If you ever need anything, just call." Harold had kept the card but never used it. He was too proud, too determined to handle things on his own. Martha would have scolded him for being so stubborn. He could almost hear her voice. "Harold Thompson, there's no shame in asking for help when you need it." Just then, a loud crash made him jump. Looking out his window, Harold saw his mailbox lying on the ground again. 2 bikers were high-fiving each other, celebrating their morning vandalism. As he watched, one of them walked over to his rose garden, pretending to start up a lawnmower while his friend filmed him on a phone. Harold's hands started shaking again, but this time with anger. These weren't just pranks anymore. They were destroying everything he and Martha had built together. Each broken rose, each piece of graffiti, each act of vandalism was like an attack on their memories. Walking back to his kitchen, Harold picked up his old flip phone. The business card trembled in his other hand as he slowly dialed the number. Would anyone even answer? Would they care about an old veteran's problems with some local troublemakers? The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Harold's heart sank. Maybe the number wasn't even working anymore. Maybe. Veterans Association, this is John speaking. How can I help a fellow veteran today? The voice was clear and strong. Harold's throat felt tight as he tried to speak. "My name is Harold Thompson," he said quietly. "I served in World War II." "It's an honor, sir," John replied immediately. What can we do for you? Harold's voice cracked as he started to explain. He told John about the bikers, the vandalism, the sleepless nights. He described the crushed roses, the graffiti, the constant noise. As he spoke, the words came faster, releasing weeks of fear and frustration. Mr. Thompson, John said when Harold finished, you did the right thing by calling. We take care of our own. Can you write down my cell phone number? I'm going to need your address, and then I'm going to make some calls. For the first time in weeks, Harold felt a glimmer of hope. As he wrote down John's number, he could hear more motorcycles arriving next door. The music was starting again, and loud laughter echoed through his walls. But something was different now. Harold Thompson, 93-year-old World War II veteran, had finally made the call that would change everything. He didn't know it yet, but help was already on the way. John Martinez sat in his office at the Veterans Association, still holding his phone after Harold's call. At 45 years old, the former Marine had helped many veterans, but something about Harold's situation made his blood boil. He looked at the address he had written down and started making calls. Listen up, John said into his phone. We've got a World War II vet being harassed by some wannabe bikers. I need everybody who can ride to meet me tomorrow morning. He made call after call, reaching out to his network of veteran riders. Meanwhile, Harold spent another restless night listening to the noise next door. The bikers seemed louder than ever, almost as if they knew he had asked for help. Around midnight, someone threw a bottle that hit his front door. Harold sat in his dark living room, holding Martha's picture and praying he had done the right thing by calling. Early the next morning, Harold heard a different kind of motorcycle approaching. This one sounded steadier, more purposeful. Looking out his window, he saw a single rider parking in front of his house. The man was tall and strong, wearing a leather jacket with Marine Corps patches. A knock at the door made Harold jump. Using his cane, he walked slowly to answer it. Standing on his porch was John Martinez, his face serious but kind. Mr. Thompson, John said, offering his hand. I'm John from the Veterans Association. May I come in? Harold's hands were shaking as he invited John inside. In his kitchen, John listened carefully as Harold showed him the damage to his property. He took pictures of the graffiti, the crushed flowers, and the knocked-over mailbox. Mr. Thompson, John said, his voice firm but gentle, what these people are doing isn't just disrespectful, it's criminal harassment. But we're going to fix this. Today. Harold looked confused. But how? The police said they can't do anything unless they catch them in the act. John smiled. We have our own ways of handling things. Legal ways, but effective. Would you trust another veteran to help you? Before Harold could answer, the sound of motorcycles filled the air again, but these weren't the usual troublemakers. These engines sounded different, more disciplined. Harold and John walked to the front door. Coming down the street was a long line of motorcycles, at least 30 of them. The riders were all wearing leather jackets with military patches. Marines, Army, Air Force, Navy. Some had police badges on their belts. Others wore business suits under their riding gear. These are my friends, John explained. Every one of them is a veteran. Some are police officers, some are lawyers, some are business owners. But all of them respect what you did for our country. The riders parked their bikes in a perfect line along the street. One by one, they walked up to Harold's porch, each one saluting him with respect. An older rider stepped forward, his jacket covered in Vietnam War patches. Staff Sergeant Harold Thompson, the man said, reading from the service record John had found. Silver Star recipient, World War II. Sir, it's an honor to meet you. Harold's eyes filled with tears as more riders approached. They brought tools and supplies. Some started fixing his mailbox. Others began cleaning the graffiti off his fence. A group of them worked on restoring his garden, carefully replanting the damaged roses. You see, Mr. Thompson, John said, putting a hand on Harold's shoulder, when you served our country, you became part of a family. And family takes care of its own. The sound of engines in the empty lot next door told them the troublemakers were arriving. But today was going to be different. Harold watched as John straightened his jacket and turned toward the lot. Would you like to watch how real bikers handle bullies? John asked with a smile. For the first time in weeks, Harold stood tall, without leaning on his cane. He wasn't alone anymore. His fellow veterans had answered his call, and everything was about to change. The troublemaker bikers rolled into the empty lot as usual, their music blasting and engines revving. But today, something was different. Instead of a frightened old man watching from behind his curtains, they saw Harold Thompson standing proudly on his front porch, surrounded by dozens of veteran riders. The leader of the troublemakers, a young man named Mike, cut his engine and stared in confusion. His usual parking spot was blocked by a line of perfectly maintained motorcycles, each one displaying military service flags. The other troublemakers pulled up behind him, their loud music suddenly seeming out of place. John Martinez stepped forward, his Marine Corps jacket gleaming in the morning sun. Behind him, 30 veteran riders stood in a quiet, disciplined line. Some wore police uniforms under their riding gear, others had business suits showing beneath their leather jackets. "Good morning," John called out, his voice carrying across the lot. "We'd like to have a conversation about how you've been treating our fellow veteran." Mike tried to laugh, but it came out nervous. "Hey, this ain't your business. We're just having some fun." A tall rider stepped forward, his police badge visible on his belt. "Actually, harassment and vandalism are very much our business." He held up a folder. "We documented every incident, every piece of graffiti, every act of vandalism, every threat." Harold watched from his porch as more veteran riders approached the lot. They moved with military precision, their faces serious but calm. Among them was a woman in a business suit with an Air Force patch on her riding jacket. "I'm the district attorney," she announced clearly, "and I'm very interested in the video you posted online yesterday showing you damaging Mr. Thompson's property." The troublemakers shifted uncomfortably on their bikes. Some of them were starting to realize how serious the situation had become. Mike looked around, counting the veteran riders who now surrounded the lot. John walked closer to Mike's bike. "You see that man on the porch?" he asked, pointing to Harold. "While you were vandalizing his garden, do you know what he was doing 75 years ago? He was fighting for your freedom in World War II. He earned a Silver Star, saving his entire unit." Mike's face turned red as John continued. "That garden you destroyed? Those roses were planted with his late wife. That fence you covered in graffiti? He built it himself when he came home from war." The veteran riders had begun cleaning up the lot, picking up trash and broken bottles. One group was repainting Harold's fence, while others replanted his garden. They worked with military efficiency, transforming the area. An older veteran approached Mike, his Vietnam service patches visible. "Son, I'm going to make this simple," he said quietly. "This harassment ends today. Mr. Thompson is under our protection now. We ride by here every day, and we have friends in every police department in the county." Mike looked at his fellow troublemakers, then back at the line of veteran riders. He saw police officers, lawyers, business owners, and active military personnel, all united to protect one of their own. For the first time, he felt ashamed. "We," Mike started, his voice shaky. "We didn't know he was a war hero." "It shouldn't matter," John replied firmly. "But since you mention it, let me introduce you properly." John walked over to Harold and helped him down the porch steps. Despite his age, Harold walked tall, his veteran's cap sitting proudly on his head. The troublemakers watched in silence as he approached. "This is Staff Sergeant Harold Thompson," John announced. "He fought for your right to ride those bikes and live freely. All he asked was for some peace in his final years." Mike slowly got off his bike and walked toward Harold. The veteran riders watched carefully, ready to step in, but they didn't need to. Mike stopped in front of Harold and did something none of his friends had ever seen him do. He extended his hand and said, "I'm sorry, sir. We were wrong. Very wrong." Harold looked at the young man's hand, then at the veterans who had come to his aid. In that moment, he wasn't just a 93-year-old man being bullied. He was a soldier again, surrounded by his brothers and sisters in arms. He shook Mike's hand, showing the same courage that had earned him the Silver Star so many years ago. The next few days brought amazing changes to Harold's neighborhood. The veteran riders kept their promise, taking shifts to ride past his house throughout the day. But what surprised Harold most was the change in Mike and his group of young bikers. The morning after the confrontation, Mike returned to the empty lot. This time, he came alone and parked his bike quietly. Harold watched from his porch as the young man walked up to his gate, carrying something in his hands. Mr. Thompson, Mike called out softly, I brought you some rose bushes. I know they won't replace the ones we destroyed, but he held up two small plants in pots, their buds just beginning to show yellow petals, the same color as Martha's favorites. Harold slowly made his way down his porch steps. John Martinez, who had stayed nearby, watched carefully from his motorcycle, but there was no need for concern. Mike's face showed genuine regret as he offered the roses to Harold. My grandmother, Mike said, looking at the ground, she loved roses too. She passed away last year. I've been angry since then, taking it out on everyone. He paused, his voice shaking. When I saw your garden destroyed, it reminded me of hers. I'm really sorry, sir. Harold took the rose bushes, his old hands gentle with the young plants. Would you like to help me plant them? He asked quietly. Mike nodded, and together they began working in the garden. As they dug the holes for the new roses, more surprises arrived. Other members of Mike's crew showed up, carrying cleaning supplies and paint. Without being asked, they began scrubbing the remaining graffiti off Harold's fence. John watched from across the street, smiling as he made calls to his veteran network. You won't believe what I'm seeing, he told them. Those young troublemakers, they're doing yard work for Mr. Thompson. Throughout the day, more people joined in. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous cookies for everyone. The Johnson kids came with their parents to help clean up the empty lot. Even the mail carrier stayed after delivering the mail, helping to repaint Harold's mailbox. Mike discovered that Harold had been a mechanic in the war. As they planted the roses, Harold shared stories about fixing tanks under enemy fire. Mike, who worked at a local auto shop, listened with genuine interest. Sir, Mike said during a break, would it be okay if I brought my bike by sometimes? I'd love to learn more about mechanics from someone with your experience. Harold's eyes lit up. It had been years since anyone had asked about his mechanical knowledge. I might be a bit rusty, he said with a smile, but I'd like that. The veteran riders continued their patrols, but now they often found Mike or his friends already there, helping Harold with his garden or listening to his stories. The empty lot, once a source of trouble, was transformed into a clean, peaceful space. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching the sunset, he heard motorcycles approaching. But instead of feeling fear, he smiled. Mike and two of his friends pulled up, their bikes purring quietly instead of roaring. Mr. Thompson, Mike called out, we had an idea. Would it be okay if we set up a small memorial in the lot? For veterans like you, and maybe, he hesitated, for people like my grandmother too. Harold stood up slowly, looking at the young men who had changed so much in just a few days. Behind them, John Martinez pulled up on his bike, nodding in approval. I think that would be wonderful, Harold said, his voice strong and clear. But only if you let me help design it. The young bikers grinned, and even John laughed. The sound of their happy conversation filled the evening air, replacing the old noise of anger and disrespect. As Harold went to bed that night, he looked at Martha's picture on his nightstand. You were right, my dear, he whispered. Sometimes the worst situations bring out the best in people. He fell asleep easily, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of unexpected friendship and healing. 6 months had passed since the day Harold Thompson made that life-changing phone call. The empty lot next to his house was now unrecognizable. Where there had once been trash and trouble, a beautiful veterans' memorial garden stood, complete with benches, flags, and carefully tended flowers. Every Saturday morning, the quiet street came alive with the sound of motorcycles, but now, instead of causing fear, these sounds brought smiles to everyone's faces. The veteran riders would gather in Harold's driveway, joining Mike and his younger riders for what had become known as the Saturday Morning Veterans Breakfast Club. Mrs. Rodriguez had turned these gatherings into her personal mission, bringing fresh pastries and her famous coffee. The Johnson kids would run between the parked bikes, now wearing little leather vests that the veterans had given them, complete with American flag patches. Harold's front porch had become the central meeting point. His rocking chair, once a lonely seat for quiet mornings, was now surrounded by folding chairs where riders of all ages would sit and listen to his stories. Young and old veterans shared their experiences, while others simply came to show respect and learn. Mike had kept his promise about learning mechanics. Every Wednesday afternoon, he would bring his bike over, and Harold would teach him the tricks he'd learned fixing military vehicles during the war. Other young riders started joining these lessons, eager to learn from the old veterans' experience. "You see this part here?" Harold would say, pointing with steady hands at a motorcycle engine. "Reminds me of the time we had to fix a tank under heavy fire in France." The young riders would lean in closer, captivated by both the mechanical knowledge and the history lessons that came with it. The memorial in the lot had become a community project. Mike and his friends had built it, but everyone contributed. The veteran riders brought flags and plaques. Local businesses donated materials. The Johnson kids planted flowers. At the center stood a simple stone with words that Harold had chosen, in honor of all who served, past, present, and future. One special corner of the memorial was dedicated to Martha and others who had supported veterans at home. Mike had insisted on this addition, thinking of his own grandmother. Harold often stood there in quiet moments, looking at Martha's name and smiling, knowing she would have loved what their neighborhood had become. The police rarely patrolled the area anymore. They didn't need to. The veteran riders still came by regularly, but now they stopped to chat and share stories rather than keep watch. Some of them had even started mentoring Mike's younger riders, helping them find better jobs and purpose in their lives. On Harold's 94th birthday, the community surprised him. When he stepped out onto his porch that morning, he found over 100 motorcycles lined up along his street. Riders from across the state had come to celebrate. The local newspaper was there to capture the moment when Mike and John Martinez presented Harold with a custom-made leather jacket, complete with his World War II unit patches. "Speech," someone called out as Harold put on the jacket. Standing at his porch railing, looking out at the crowd, he felt stronger than he had in years. 6 months ago, Harold said, his voice clear and strong, "I was a lonely old man, afraid in my own home. Today, I have more family than I ever dreamed possible." He looked at Mike, then at John, then at all the faces before him. "You didn't just save my home, you gave me a new purpose." As the crowd cheered, Mrs. Rodriguez brought out a huge cake decorated with American flags. The Johnson kids ran around handing out plates. Veterans young and old, their families, neighbors, and friends all celebrated together. That evening, as the last guests left and the street grew quiet, Harold sat on his porch. The smell of roses drifted up from his garden, now more beautiful than ever. The memorial flags in the lot next door fluttered gently in the breeze. From somewhere down the street came the distant sound of a motorcycle, its engine a gentle rumble that no longer brought fear, only comfort. Harold touched the leather jacket he still wore, feeling the patches that told his story. At 94, he had found a new chapter in life, surrounded by an unexpected family of brothers and sisters in arms, bound together by respect, service, and the understanding that it's never too late to make a difference in someone's life.